The date is Friday the 1st of February 1974, another hot summer's day in downtown Sao Paulo, Brazil. The city is bustling, the workers looking forwards to the weekend. A fire starts in an overheated air conditioning unit on the 12th floor of the Joelma building, and the fire quickly spreads. This tragedy will claim the lives of 189 people in the deadliest high-rise fire of all time. Built in 1971, the Joelma building was a 25-storey high-rise building in the downtown area of Sao Paulo, Brazil's largest city. It was leased by the Banco Crefisa for office space. At the time the fire started, there were estimated to be over 750 people inside the building, most of them employees of the bank. At approximately 8:50 a.m, a faulty air conditioning unit on the 12th floor overheated, causing a short circuit and small fire. This was a window-mounted unit, and the fire quickly spread to the curtains. One employee went down to the lobby to prevent any more people from entering the building, whilst attempts were made to fight the fire on the 12th floor. The fire was very smoky, and initial attempts to put the fire out using a fire extinguisher failed. The fire began to spread rapidly. By 9:03 a.m, the fire had been spotted by an onlooker across the street, and the emergency services were called. They arrived just 7 minutes later, at 9:10, and flames were by now visible, licking up the outside walls of the building. Fire crews entered the building but were unable to climb higher than the 11th floor due to the excessive heat and smoke. With the only stairwell impassable, rescue attempts would have to be made from the outside. By 9:20, the whole of the upper part of the building was ablaze. The fire raged, completely out of control. Huge crowds gathered to witness the unfolding tragedy, inadvertently hampering the arrival of additional rescue vehicles. By now, anyone trapped on the upper floors could see that there was no way down, and people began climbing onto the outside of the building. Their only chance to find respite from the flames was on the outer spandrels of the building. These narrow concrete projections protruded only 90 centimetres. One can only imagine the terror of being trapped on a narrow ledge like this, hundreds of feet above the street, while the inferno raged all around. The ladders from the fire trucks were only able to reach the 11th floor, and poor water pressure meant that there was almost nothing that could be done from ground level to fight the fire. The blaze raged unchecked, the entire upper building completely engulfed in flames. Over 150 people had climbed to the roof of the building, desperately hoping to be airlifted to safety, but the plumes of fire and dense smoke shooting from the top of the building made it impossible for the circling helicopters to land. Footage shows terrified people trying to flee the flames on the rooftop, but with nowhere left to run. Helicopters lowered rescuers on ropes to try and airlift people who were trapped on the narrow building ledges, but again the swirling flames and smoke made this almost impossible to attempt with any degree of safety. In desperation, over 40 people jumped to escape the terrible flames. Some tried to grab the fire ladders as they fell, causing other survivors and rescuers to fall. None of those who jumped survived. Finally, having burned through all the combustible material in the building, at about 10:30 a.m. the fire began to subside. Helicopters were finally able to land on the roof, where incredibly 80 people had survived by hiding under asbestos roof tiles. Survivors were airlifted to neighbouring rooftops for urgent medical attention. People who had been trapped for up to 4 hours on the tiny concrete ledges were finally rescued. This operation was hazardous to say the least. For example, in order to rescue a young man from the 18th floor, the main fire ladder was raised to the 12th floor, with a secondary ladder then propped up on top to reach the 16th floor. The young man then had to climb down the outside of the building from the 18th floor to reach the secondary ladder. In the end, the tragedy claimed the lives of 189 people, and over 350 were injured, many seriously. As of the making of this video, it remains the worst death toll for a high-rise building fire. The footage of the disaster is truly shocking. When shown on television, it prompted calls for a complete overhaul of the building safety codes not only in Brazil, but around the world. The inquiry into the tragedy found many shortcomings. In fact, there seemed to be hardly any aspect of the building that could not have been improved. As one commentator succinctly put it, if you were trying to design a building that would kill people in a fire, this is how you'd do it. Built in 1971, the Joelma building used the concrete pillar and slab construction method common to many buildings of this time. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong in the use of this type of construction in regards to fire safety. Indeed, after the fire, the building was renovated and returned to use as the underlying structure was still intact. Just why the building proved so deadly was down to the design, the internal furnishings, and the total lack of fire prevention measures. The floor plan of the building shows two irregular shaped wings joined to a common central area where the staircase and lifts were located. There were no internal divisions separating this central core from the two wings. It was completely open plan. If a fire took hold, there would be no way to contain it in just one part of the building. Note that there is only one central staircase. The building had no separate fire stairs. Once the lifts became inoperable and the stairs impassable, there would be no other way down. Ceilings were made from flammable pressed fibre tiles suspended on wooden slats. Office partitions were made from wooden panelling. There were synthetic furnishings throughout the building. There was an abundance of paper, as well as lots of plastic office furniture and electrical equipment. It later came to light that the whole building had also been lined with a flammable plastic insulation. Once the fire began, it spread very quickly, easily able to travel along the combustible ceilings. The central open stairwell acted like a chimney, spreading the fire up through the centre of the building. At the same time, the fire was able to spread upwards on the outside. The heat shattered the windows of the floor above, and the fire leapt up from floor to floor. To compound the problem of the rapidly spreading blaze, fire prevention measures present in the building were practically non-existent. There was no sprinkler system, nor were there any emergency stairs or emergency lighting. There was no fire alarm system installed. Once established, the fire was able to spread unchecked. The majority of people who were successfully evacuated during the early minutes of the fire were done so using the 4 lifts which were located in the central service core of the building. An estimated 300 people were saved by using the lifts until the heat became too severe and this had to be abandoned. There were incredible acts of bravery during this tragedy. Sergeant Jose Rufino was able to rig a rope line from a neighbouring building and shimmy over to the burning edifice. He was able to rescue 18 people this way before the ropes burned through. A mother jumped from the 15th floor, cradling a newborn baby. She tragically died, but the baby survived. Almost unbelievably, there'd been another high-rise fire in Sao Paulo just 2 years previously, when the Andraus building caught fire, trapping hundreds of people inside. Although there were many injuries, miraculously, the death toll was relatively low, with only 16 fatalities. As a result, no changes to the fire safety code were made, and nobody thought to look at the potential risks present in other downtown high-rise buildings. An opportunity to avert disaster had been tragically missed. In the aftermath of the Joelma fire, the city of Sao Paulo upgraded its firefighting service, which had been shown to be woefully inadequate to tackle a situation of this magnitude. Building codes were updated, not only in Brazil, but in other parts of the world, notably the USA. The awful spectacle of a burning building full of trapped people proved too much to ignore this time. Perhaps the fact that 50 years later the Joelma building fire still holds its grisly record for the most fatalities means that lessons were learned, although it cannot be denied that these lessons were learned too late for the victims here. After the fire, the burned-out shell was closed for 4 years, during which time it was repaired and renovated for future use. It stands today as the Edifício Praça da Bandeira. It was last inspected for fire safety in 2013, and it passed with flying colours. The iconic photograph says it all. In sheer desperation, a man leaps from the 10th story of a burning hotel, hoping to use a mattress to cushion his fall. Tragically, he dies on impact, as does everyone else who leaps from the building. I remember seeing this photograph when I was young, and I can clearly remember the feeling of horror that it gave me. Years later, I came across the image again in a book, and I learned that, by fatalities, that this is still ranked as the worst hotel fire in history. The hotel in the photograph is the Taeyong-kak Hotel in the South Korean capital Seoul, and the date was December the 25th, 1971. Photographs from the time show a city vastly different from the high-tech metropolis that is South Korea's capital today. In the late 1960s, the city was growing rapidly, with many high-rise tower blocks springing up around the older brick buildings and Buddhist temples. One of the tallest buildings was the Taeyong-kak Hotel. Constructed in 1969, it was a 22-story luxury hotel, built to accommodate visiting dignitaries, rich foreign tourists, and wealthy Koreans. On Christmas Day 1971, the hotel was packed with guests, as there was to be an all-day party held on the upper floors. The hotel register listed the occupancy as 202, but there were certainly more people in the building if you included the staff and other guests. At around 10 AM, there was an explosion in the second-story coffee shop, apparently caused by a leaking propane tank. Although not strong enough to cause any serious structural damage to the building, the explosion started a fire, which quickly spread through the lower floors, trapping everyone above. The lifts became inoperable, and the only two staircases in the building had no fireproof doors. These staircases had been designed as an alternate method of egress from the building in case of a power outage, but with a fire raging in the lower part of the building, they simply acted as chimneys, rapidly funneling flames and thick black smoke up through the building. The fire brigade reacted as quickly as they could, but having arrived on scene, it became apparent that the ladders would only reach to the 4th floor. Fire hoses were able to douse the building up to the 8th floor, but by then the building was completely ablaze, with thick smoke and flame pouring from the windows. In a desperate attempt to rescue somebody, anybody, helicopters were scrambled. The roof hadn't been designed with a landing pad, and the billowing smoke made getting close to the building very risky, but the choppers circled the building, dangling rope ladders and slings beneath them. It was reported that 8 guests managed to grab them and were saved, although at least 2 people fell to their deaths while attempting to reach safety this way. Crowds had gathered to watch the unfolding tragedy, and among them the photographer Kim Dong-jun. It's estimated that about 35 people leapt from the building, all of whom died. It was during this time that Kim took the famous photograph of the unnamed man jumping from the window clutching the mattress. That was the photograph that went on to win second prize in the 1972 World Press Photograph Awards. The blaze raged for 10 hours before burning itself out. The final grim toll was 164 dead and 65 others seriously wounded. The initial investigation revealed an all too familiar tale. Flammable furnishings had been used throughout the building, going against the existing regulations. There was no dedicated fire escape inside or outside the building, and there was a serious lack of firefighting equipment in the hotel itself. The emergency lighting failed, leaving guests trapped, groping around in the darkness on the upper floors. Prior to the opening of the hotel, building inspections had been skipped. The inspectors paid off to turn a blind eye so that the hotel could open on time. 8 people were subsequently arrested and charged, including the hotel owner, hotel managers, and city fire inspectors. The fire made headlines around the world and prompted city officials to improve the firefighting capabilities of the Seoul Fire Brigade. Surprisingly, the building itself was not demolished, but was refitted and returned to use. Walking past it today, you'd have no idea of the terrible tragedy which occurred here 50 years ago almost to the day. It was Halloween night 1970. A club full of young people dancing, an up-and-coming rock band from Paris playing as the main attraction. Spirits are high, the club is packed, but what should have been a great night out ends up being a night to remember for all the wrong reasons. A fire breaks out, and within minutes the club song set becomes the scene of France's worst ever nightclub tragedy. It's 1970. The swinging 60s are officially over, and the heady days of disco are yet to begin, but the nightclub scene is as vibrant as ever. This is the era of the baby boom generation, the children born in the first decade of peace after World War II. This is a generation who have only known peace and prosperity, and with the advent of rock and roll, this is a generation that likes to party. To fulfill this need, nightclubs and bars are springing up all over, and rural France is no exception. Opened in April 1970, the club song Set was the main attraction for the youth of Grenoble, Aix-les-Bains and Chambéry, and was situated a couple of kilometres outside the small picturesque town of Saint-Laurent-du-Pont in southeast France. From the outside, it didn't look like much. A large but nondescript modern building with a corrugated roof. Anyone driving past during the day probably wouldn't give it a second glance. However, inside, the three owners of the club had transformed it to be the latest thing in psychedelic decor. The ground floor housed the bar, stage area and dance floor. Around the walls were small alcoves or grottos where club patrons could sit and drink and smoke and watch the band and the dance floor. A single metal spiral staircase led upstairs, where more alcoves looked out from a gallery above. The alcoves were made from papier-mâché and polystyrene, and the support columns were wreathed in colourful plastic ribbons. Plastic banners hung from the roof and were draped on the walls. The entire space was festooned with very loud, very colourful, and very flammable material. On Saturday, October the 31st, 1970, the club song set was the venue for a rising rock band from Paris called Storm. Performing their own material, as well as covers from the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, the night was sure to be a sellout. To prevent gate crashing, the side exit doors had been locked. Entry and exit was going to be through the turnstile only. An 8-foot-high, full-door turnstile ensured that all patrons would be paying ones. Nobody would be getting in or going out without going through the turnstile. At about 1:40 in the morning, the club was still packed. There's about 200 young people still watching Storm as they crank out their big finale number, the Rolling Stones hit Satisfaction. On the upper gallery, somebody accidentally dropped a match onto one of the polyester cushions. The people in the alcove noticed smoke and flame, and the cushion ignited. The fire started to spread quickly to the wall decor. They tried beating out the flames by hand, but it was no use. An eyewitness recounts, "I was at the top of the gallery. I saw a small flame on a seat and a boy who tried to extinguish it with his hands. I went down calmly to tell those who were downstairs to get out. It was just as I was at the turnstile that the panic began." The flames had begun to spread, and the first shouts of fire went around the club. The band were still playing when the first flash of fire hit the ceiling decor and the blaze really took hold. Within 30 seconds, the entire roof and walls of the club were ablaze. One of the club owners, Gilbert Bass, was in his office when he saw the alarm light go on. Thinking that there was maybe a fight in progress, he hurried outside to get round to the club entrance. Bass stated, "As I arrived in front, I heard screaming, 'There is fire!' and at the same time I saw people coming out whose clothes were on fire. A huge flame forced me to step back. The Sunset was not equipped with the phone, so I jumped in the car to alert the police. Within a minute of the initial blaze, the whole club was choked with acrid black smoke. In the panicked rush for the only visible exit, the crush of bodies jammed the turnstile. After that, nobody got out. The whole place went up in flames. No one inside stood a chance. Gilbert Baz had to drive the 2 kilometres to Saint-Laurent-du-Pont to alert the emergency services to the tragedy that was unfolding behind him. By the time the fire brigade got back to the club, it was obvious that there was no hope of rescuing anyone still trapped inside. As one fireman said, they didn't have a chance. The whole place went up like a matchbox. By 5 a.m. the blaze had been extinguished. The walls of the club were still intact, but the metal roof had melted away in the heat. The interior of the club was a charred wreck. The firemen began the task of removing the bodies, many of which were unidentifiable, burned beyond recognition. 140 young people had perished inside the club that night. Of the 40 or so survivors who had managed to get out, 6 later died in hospital from their wounds. The final death toll for the club Sunset fire was 146. The victims were all aged between 17 and 26. It is one of France's worst ever death tolls from fire and the 10th deadliest nightclub fire of all time. The victims included 2 of the 3 owners of the club and all the members of the rock group Storm. A temporary morgue was set up in the town hall and the charred bodies were moved. The authorities had managed to collect wallets, jewellery and personal items from the bodies. These were to be used to try to identify the dead. They were placed in yellow envelopes. Opening these envelopes and finding these personal effects was how most parents learned that their worst fears had come true on that terrible Sunday morning. For unidentified victims, appeals featuring personal effects were made to try and establish their identities. This one asked for anyone recognising the lady's watch to come forwards with a name. A mass funeral was held 2 days later, the coffins laid out in the gymnasium of Saint-Laurent-du-Pont. The bodies of those identified were taken back to their local towns and villages for burial. There were 19 victims who were never able to be identified. They were buried in a dedicated plot in the churchyard at Saint-Laurent-du-Pont. The shock and the grief was raw. This was a national tragedy, but it had devastated the local community. People were angry. How could this have happened when regulations were supposed to be in place to prevent this kind of tragedy? An inquiry was set up at once to find out what had gone so tragically wrong at the Club Sunset. Unsurprisingly, the inquiry didn't have to look far before it found some obvious failings. The local building safety department hadn't inspected the club before it opened, although it was required by law to do so. The legal limit on the number of people allowed into the club seemed to be missing. There was no paperwork showing what it should be. The interior decorations that were made from plastic, polystyrene and papier-mâché were completely illegal and should never have been used. The building should have had 3 access doors. It turned out that one had been sealed up during the construction of the club, and the other 2 were locked on the night in question. These 2 emergency exits weren't illuminated, and they were both blocked by stacks of chairs and a screen behind the band. The gallery level had no exit. People were forced to flee down the narrow spiral staircase and into the club below. There was no firefighting equipment on site, even though a list of this should have been sent to the town hall and signed off before the club could open. There was no telephone. Now, this wasn't a legal requirement, but given the remote location of the club, common sense dictates that a phone should have been one of the first things that was installed. Against the background of these obvious failings, the local mayor, Pierre Perrin, and the Secretary-General of the Prefecture, Albert Ulrich, were suspended from duty. Public sentiment was becoming increasingly hostile and frustrated. On November the 6th, the French Interior Minister announced that the club had in fact been operating illegally, as there had been no formal inspection prior to opening in April 1970, and the mayor had never granted official permission for the club to open. Mayor Perrin and the 2 building contractors involved in the construction of the club were charged with causing injury through negligence. They were found guilty and sentenced to 15, 13 and 10-month suspended sentences. Gilbert Baz, the only surviving owner of the club, was charged with manslaughter and sentenced to 2 years in prison. This was later reduced on appeal to 18 months suspended. Baz continued to live in the area, working in a local paper mill. He never spoke publicly again about the incident, and he died in January 2021. It's clear that many others were involved in turning a blind eye to their duties in regards to the safety of Club Sunset. Indeed, it's reported that the local chief of police and an entourage of other local officials were drinking in the club just 2 nights before the fire. It seemed that all the regulations in the world won't do any good if the people in charge of enforcing them are incompetent or lazy. There is a memorial to the 146 victims at the site of the Club Sunset. The building itself has long been since demolished, and there's now a grassy open area where it once stood. People in the local area still remember the tragedy as if it were only yesterday. Take these words from Jacqueline Bourgil, a nurse who was on duty that terrible Sunday morning back in 1970. 50 years on, she spoke of the tragedy and how she still remembers it vividly. On November the 1st, I was working in the emergency department. A colleague of mine had received burns from the dance club, and she'd called for me. I enter. I discover an inert body. She's totally charred, the belt embedded in the charred flesh. Only the whites of her eyes and the belt buckle stood out. A strong smell filled the throat, and you could feel the heat coming off from her. This is the painful and macabre memory that I've kept. Everybody loves fireworks, right? Fun, celebration, good times. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. In today's video, we'll look at what happens when things go spectacularly wrong, and this is the tragic tale of the Mesa Redonda fireworks incident of 2001. The 1980s and the 1990s were periods of rapid change for the economies of South America. During the 80s, many South American nations abandoned the old systems of rigid state control, pushing instead for the privatisation of national industry and introducing much looser fiscal policy. This in turn was followed by the full embracing of global economic policy during the 1990s. In an all too familiar story, these economic changes, combined with endemic corruption and government cronyism, had the effect of making those already rich even wealthier, whilst the middle class withered and disappeared, and the poorest in society sunk ever deeper into grinding poverty. In Lima, the Peruvian capital, those changes manifested themselves profoundly, as many rural Peruvians were migrating from the countryside looking for work, and at the same time the rich were moving out to newly built suburban locales that came complete with new international hotels, business headquarters and luxury beachfront complexes. Looking for any way to make ends meet in the face of crushing unemployment, the informal or cash-in-hand economy grew steadily. As older, established city centre shopping closed down, their place was taken by street vendors and crowded makeshift markets. Much of the stuff that was on sale was the kind of thing you find in any informal street market. Knock-off designer clothes, fake watches, kitsch decor, plastic toys and novelty items. A lot of it cheaply imported from Asia, courtesy of the new global economy. However, around Christmas time and with the approaching New Year, one type of vendor became much more prevalent, the firework vendor. And the one-stop shop for all your firework needs was the market area known as Mesa Redonda. This area was typical of many unofficial night markets found throughout the world. A tightly packed warren of narrow streets, filled with shoppers, street vendors, and compact multi-storey shopping galleries filled with tiny shops. On the evening of the 29th of December 2001, Mesa Redonda was packed with shoppers, many of them there specifically to buy fireworks. Eyewitnesses from that night described the zone as being filled with firework vendors, mostly informal ones, who set up stalls right there in the narrow streets. The entire area was congested, customers jostling past one another, winding their way through the parked cars, street stalls, and mountains of cardboard boxes containing the fireworks. Fireworks were piled up in the roads, stored on rooftops, and sold out of the back of parked vans. Some of the boxes had split, and there were reports of loose gunpowder being scattered around on the floor near to some of these stalls. The official estimate is that there were probably around 1,000 tons of fireworks on sale in Mesa Redonda that night. Now, it was just after 7 p.m. that one unlicensed street seller had the mother of all bad ideas and decided that a live demonstration of a firework was what was needed to clinch a sale with a pedantic customer. And so the fuse was lit. The firework duly went off and immediately spiralled out of control and landed in a pile of boxes stored on a nearby rooftop. As luck would have it, these boxes also contained fireworks, which in turn ignited, setting off a chain reaction along the street vendor stalls. Within moments, fireworks were igniting left, right and centre, the whole area erupting with loud bangs, flashes and explosions, with thousands of terrified shoppers right in the middle of it all. The exploding fireworks quickly set fire to parked cars, flammable goods in shops, and plastic tarpaulins that were used to cover the stalls. Anything that could burn was quickly ignited, and the entire shopping area became engulfed in flame within a few short minutes. Firefighters were quickly on scene, but were unable to get anywhere near the centre of the inferno due to the burning cars and vans which had blocked any hope of access for the fire trucks, and the throngs of terrified fleeing shoppers who clogged the narrow lanes. Many people were trapped on upper floors, either in apartments or on the top floors of the mini gallerias, and desperate rescue attempts were made to get them free. Some attempts were successful, and some attempts were not. As temperatures rose at the heart of the Mesa Redonda fire, any combustible material began to spontaneously ignite, and a firestorm swept through the market. Temperatures at the heart of the fire reached an estimated 1,200 degrees centigrade, hot enough to burn bone into ash and to melt steel. Firemen battled the raging fire for over 8 hours before finally bringing the blaze under control. By morning, the devastation was clear for all to see. The entire area resembled a grisly open-air crematorium. The destruction was absolute, and the death toll was shocking. Officially, there were 291 fatalities, 187 wounded, and 180 people missing. Best estimates as to the actual death toll put it at around 400, as the incredible heat from the centre of the fire is believed to have incinerated many of the victims to ash, thus making any kind of precise count impossible. Regardless, with an official death toll of 291, the Mesa Redonda incident is still the deadliest firework-related tragedy of all time. Many of those who perished were unable to be identified and were buried in the El Angel Cemetery in spaces marked with just numbers. The scale of the tragedy forced the authorities to act. The president at the time, Alejandro Toledo, visited the scene and met with survivors in hospital. The tragedy made headlines all over the Spanish-speaking world, and subsequent legislation, enacted by the authorities in Lima, banned the sale of fireworks by unlicensed vendors. And, since the disaster, raids by the police are commonplace, although they do still catch people selling illegal fireworks in Mesa Redonda. As for the genius who decided to set off the firework that caused all this death and destruction, he has never been brought to justice. In 2016, the Peruvian police arrested and publicly named Magin Rodolfo Diaz, a welder from the city of Jauja, as the guilty culprit. However, he was later released owing to a police error. Now, I was unable to find out if there was some legal technicality which allowed him to go free, or whether the police had just simply got the wrong guy. Whatever the case, the culprit for the Mesa Redonda firework demonstration remains at liberty to this day.